you all for coming this evening to one of the many speakers in our, I'll say, social justice speaker series this year. This is our first one of the year, kicking it off with some very close friends of mine, colleagues, mentors. Before I get started, please, put your phone on vibrate so it doesn't interrupt them. Secondly, when you came in, you should have picked up an assessment. If you're in Blueprint, you should have got your own. Everyone else should have got a different one. If you don't have one, please let us know. It's important for us as we try to gauge what students are learning and gaining from the speakers and the programs that we do in the Paul Robeson Cultural Center. Thank you. My name is Carlos Wiley. I'm the director of the Paul Robeson Cultural Center here. And on behalf of the staff of the Paul Robeson Cultural Center at PRCC, thank you all for coming. So tonight we're going to hear from two very decorated and distinguished folks, as well as we have a student who is going to be the moderator for them tonight. The student is in the middle. Danielta, she is the president of Black Caucus. You're a junior, right? Majoring in educational theory and policy and African American studies. She's from Jacksonville, Florida. And so I asked Danielta to do this primarily because we had talked last year about Danielta's growth and seeing her grow since I met her as a first-year student, and we got to travel together to the National Black Student Union Conference. And I thought that Danielta would be a great person to sit and moderate Tim and Joy. So that's why Danielta is there. So thank you, Danielta. So I'll start. Tim Wise is amongst the most predominant anti-racist writers and educators in the United States. He has spent the past 25 years speaking to audiences in all 50 states and over 1,000 colleges and high school campuses at hundreds of professional and academic conferences and to community groups across the country. He is also the host of the new podcast, Speak Out with Tim Wise. He has lectured internationally in Canada, Bermuda, and has trained corporate, government, entertainment, media, law enforcement, military, and medical industry professionals on methods for dismantling racism in their institutions. Wise has provided anti-racism training to educators and administrators nationwide. Wise has been featured in several documentaries, including the 2013 Media Education Foundation release, White Like Me, Race, Racism, and White Privilege in America. The film, which he co-wrote and co-produced, has been a phenomenal educational tool in the struggle against racism. He has appeared alongside legendary scholar and activist Angela Davis in the 2011 documentary, Vocabulary of Change. In this public dialogue, the two activists, Davis and Wise, discussed the connections between issues of race, class, gender, sexuality, and militarism, as well as intergenerational movement building and the prospects for social change. Please join me in welcoming Tim Wise. Dr. Joy DeGrew is a nationally and internationally renowned researcher, educator, author, and presenter. Her seminars have been loaded as the most dynamic and inspirational, currently being presented on the topics of culture, race, relations, and contemporary social issues. She is a Tell It Like It Is ambassador for healing and a voice for those who have struggled in search of the past and continue to struggle through the present. Dr. DeGrew is the author of the groundbreaking book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, America's Legacy of Enduring Injury and Healing, which addresses the residual impacts of trauma on African descendants in the Americas. Post-traumatic slave syndrome lays the groundwork for understanding how the past has influenced the present and opens up the discussion of how we can use the strengths we have gained to heal. The book incorporates her research in both America and Africa, as well as her 20 years of experience as a social work practitioner, consultant to public and private organizations. In the book and her presentations, Dr. DeGrew examines the conditions that led to the Atlantic slave trade and allowed the pursuant racism effects at repositioning to continue throughout present day. She then looks at the similar insurmountable obstacles that African Americans face as a result of the slave trade. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joy DeGrew. One last thing before I turn it over to Danielta. Danielta is going to facilitate the conversation, after which there will be opportunity for you for questions from the audience. They've requested that if you would like to ask a question, to please write it down. You can write the question down at any time, raise your hand. One of my staff or I will come and grab the card from you, and it will be asked at the conclusion of their segment of the program. And Danielta.
Good afternoon.
Hold on. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So my first question is to you, Dr. DeGrew. What is post-traumatic slave syndrome?
Oh boy, it's one of the hardest questions. I knew it was coming, but there's just no easy way to answer it. It is precisely what it sounds like. It's multi-generational trauma as it relates to people of African descent in America. It's looking at what impact American chattel slavery has had on generations since the actual enslavement of people of African descent.
Thank you. So can you also explain epigenetics? Because you said multi-generational trauma.
Epigenetics. Okay, so epigenetics, not new. Epigenetics is a study of how the environment impacts our genes, our DNA. And recent research, they were using mice, and what they did was they conditioned these mice to have an aversion, develop an aversion to, say, licorice or peppermint. It's been replicated a couple of times. And what they were trying to do is to make certain that they could get the mouse to respond without the stimulus. So after a while, they could shock the rat, and then after a while they stopped shocking the rat, but they continued to release the smell. And when they released the smell, the rat would, or the mice would, respond. So then they tested the babies of the mouse, and the babies were born with an aversion to the smell, having never been exposed to it. And then they tested the grandbabies of the mice, and they were born with an aversion to peppermint, having never been exposed to it. So what they started to realize is that trauma is associated in some way, that markers on the DNA. And as they looked at human beings, they began to realize that trauma also shows up with humans. And there were numerous studies. One is called the Quebec Snopes experiment, where they actually looked at people, the children that were born right after a severe snowstorm. And those children, and even 2 generations later, were born with an inflammatory condition as though they had actually been in the snowstorm. So we're looking at folks adapting to the trauma and responding to it genetically, literally biologically. So it's in your genes.
So before we begin, I just want to ask, so you say epigenetics is multi-generational trauma, so how is that multi-generational trauma shown in people with African descent post-chattel slavery?
Okay, these are like easy questions, What have I done? Okay, so when I think about, where I talk about multi-generational trauma, let me just unpack that and be a little bit more kind of just down on the ground. There are behaviors when I started to look at Black people that even as a child didn't make sense to me. My father went to the 6th grade. He called himself an Asiatic Black man before Black was beautiful. So the concept of being Black was something that I kind of was raised with and had some clarity around. But it always would baffle me that when a Black person, when I was growing up, insulted another Black person, they always called them Black first. You Black, and then fill in the blank. You Black, right? And my thought was, well, you are Black, but the implication there is that when I call you Black, it should offend you. And see, that's what I started to look at. That doesn't make sense to me. Or they would say, oh my God, she was such a pretty girl, even though she was dark. You know, things like that. That's an intracultural phenomenon. And as I have traveled throughout the world, 7 countries in Africa, it wasn't an African phenomenon, but it was an African American. You also see it in the Caribbean. So you see these behaviors that are exhibited where the ideology of them, their beginnings, where these things started, was with chattel slavery. And that was what I spent a lot of time doing, was tracing contemporary behaviors all the way back to chattel slavery.
So, Mr. White, Dr. Drew talks about contemporary trauma and how that ties into chattel slavery of modern Pakistan. You talked about whiteness, so can you explain the history of whiteness within the United States?
Well, I should say that these two things are very much connected. And I think what Joy's talking about with the intergenerational transmission of trauma is the flip side of what I primarily talk about, which is the intergenerational transmission of unearned advantage and the psychology of dominance and superiority. Because sort of street-level version of the theoretical piece around post-traumatic slave syndrome would be this notion of internalized depression, right? Which is the term that I was taught by the People's Institute folks in New Orleans who trained me many years ago. This notion that people of color subjected to white supremacy will internalize a certain degree of inferiority, self-hatred, self-negation, objectification. And if you're white and you're taught dominance, then you're going to internalize the opposite of that. So all of this is very much connected. And when it comes to whiteness, it's very important that there's this old saying that the greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing the world he didn't exist. Maybe the greater trick that the devil played was convincing the world that whiteness did exist. And what I mean by that is that, when European peoples came to this continent, we were not white. There was no such thing as whiteness. There's never been a white race in a biological sense, a scientific sense, a cultural or linguistic or anthropological sense. There's no such thing as white people prior to the colonies of what become the United States. In Europe, we did not love each other. We did not consider ourselves one big happy team. Most of European history is the history of European people killing each other. That's how much we hated each other. The English hated the Irish hated them back. Everybody hated the Germans, not without reason. Northern Italians hated Southern Italians, didn't even think they were Italian. So European history, in a nutshell, thumbnail sketch, is killing each other and looking for the witch. That's pretty much the shit we did. Like, that's what we did. But we come to the colonies, and all of a sudden, it became necessary to create this team that had never existed. And the reason, ask yourself why. Why did we have to create the white race? Was there some linguistic discovery? Was there some anthropological discovery? Was there some scientific discovery that said, oh my God, we're really just all the same people? We didn't know that, but now we do know. There was no discovery, except this, that rich people, the wealthiest among the Europeans, looked around and they were pretty good at counting. And when they looked around, they saw that they were heavily outnumbered. They were outnumbered by African enslaved persons and European indentured servants who were just one level above slaves themselves. And when they looked around, they said, my God, there's like 10 to 1 poor people versus rich people. And if we don't figure out a way to divide and conquer these people, they are going to jack our stuff, right? Because they got the numbers and they're pissed and they know we're running a game on them because we own all the land and they don't have anything. So all of a sudden they create the notion of whiteness and they take these indentured servants and they say, no more of that. You're going to be free labor. And by the way, we're going to put you on a slave patrol and you're going to help us keep those people in line. So all of a sudden they're creating what W.E.B. Du Bois later would call a psychological wage of whiteness, right? Which is this idea that, well, I might not have much, but at least I'm not black. At least I'm above somebody. It's like last place avoidance, right? I might not be on top, but at least I'm not on the bottom. And so all of a sudden, these people now called white feel as though they have a stake in maintaining a system of domination. Well, how do you convince yourself to be a part of that? Especially when you're really not getting paid off it. Like, these rich people not really giving you their land. It's not like they're parceling out their land and giving you stuff. But they're making you feel superior. The only way you can do that is to allow your mind to become colonized with these ideas of internalized supremacy. So you start thinking that whiteness really means something. And what is it? And what happens? Well, all of a sudden, those colonial rebellions stop. Because there were rebellions with white and black working together to overthrow elites in places like the Virginia colony. But once you extend whiteness to these piss poor Europeans, it's like, oh, we don't need to get down with the black folks anymore. We just need to get down with these rich white people who apparently we think we're going to be like one day. And that's still happening today. You have poor white people who still vote for people that give tax cuts to everybody but them. Because one of these days, I'm going to be the boss. And when I'm the boss, I want a tax cut. You're not going to be the boss. You're never going to be the boss. You're going to be working in that coal mine till you die of black lung. That's what's going to happen to you. You're going to die on that assembly line with an injury that they don't give a damn about because they don't care about OSHA violations. They'll let the boss do whatever they want to you. But you convince yourself that you're superior, and then you cast your lot with the people who are actually your class enemy. So whiteness has created epigenetically, even though this hasn't been studied the same way, I would be unsurprised to find that it has created epigenetically a certain imprinting on the biology of white folks. Not the way trauma does exactly, but I would say it's an intergenerational loss of empathy, right? Because if you take people, and this is an important point to make, because some people misunderstand when we criticize whiteness, they think we're talking about white people or horrible people. It's not about white people, it's about whiteness as an organizing principle and as a mentality. A lot of white people reject whiteness, and some people of color adopt it. And so it's not about the people, but whiteness as an organizing principle has this capacity to take good people, who I think most folks are. I think most people, white, black, or otherwise, are good folks. But if you're a good person caught in a bad system, you have to figure out a way to make that okay. You have to figure out a way to square that circle. And the only way you can do it is to push down your empathy. Because if I actually empathize with the people who I'm enslaving or segregating or lynching or discriminating against or whatever the case is, then I won't allow that to happen. And if that's happening and it gives me a certain advantage over them, I have to figure out a way to rationalize that. And that means that I have to learn how not to be empathetic and not to teach my children empathy. And that's a horrible, horrible, horrible thing to do to a child. To teach, because children, right, when your children are naturally empathetic. Children, you can take 5-year-olds, put them in a room with people that look totally different from them, and they'll play. They're not thinking about that, really. And if they see a child in pain, they're going to gravitate to that child. And if you say that that kid can't play, those kids are going to get on you. And those kids will be like, that's not right. You know, but by the time they're 15, see, we've taught them that they have to give up all of that. So that's how whiteness, I think, operates as the flip of what Joyce talked about.
Can the people in the back hear me right now? Okay, great. Okay, so what I want to go to next is just talking about how slavery and Jim Crow affects white people. Those specific moments in history and how it affects us now.
You want to go first?
White. Slavery and Jim Crow. Okay, so what happened after slavery? There's some mythology that goes on in this country. You'll hear people say, well, you know, slavery's a long time ago, you know, you're free now, hasn't the playing field been leveled for you people? Look at other people, what they've been able to, I mean, these are kinds of things that happen because there's a mythology that, in fact, you know, somehow everything was okay. Now, when we look at American chattel slavery, emphasis on the chattel, because it was very unique in that it dehumanized people, which means that you're never going to rise to the level of the other. And so what happens with that is if you start looking at, let's say 339 years at least of chattel slavery. So now, during that period of time, you have people who are being beaten, sold, raped,